Welcome back, REL 2502, week 3. Happy Labor Day weekend to all of you. Let's get into it. So, housekeeping. You have your Christian, many of you have already turned this in, and I appreciate that, but your Christian interview subject is due September 8th. Just as a reminder, I need a name. I'm thinking of someone. I want specifically who you're thinking of interviewing. And if you have your name, I would go ahead and reach out. I will give yourself plenty of time to do this. I don't want your lack of planning to become their emergency. So again, check the appendix, one of the appendices on the syllabus if you need more help in terms of guidance, how to do this. Many of you have already submitted. That's awesome. I've come back with comments saying, hey, this person sounds interesting. Ask them about this to try to help you in terms of how to guide the interview. But that's this coming Friday, September 8th. Is when those are due. So make sure that you get those in before then, if at all possible, or on that date. The other thing in terms of housekeeping is just a question. How are things going so far? I love the responses. It seems like the quiz questions are coming along. We're moving along well. But let me just remind you, if I don't hear anything from you, my assumption is that means everything's great and you understand it and you don't have any questions. So if that's not you, I need you to be proactive, to reach out. I will respond to your emails. I will schedule Skype chats with you. Anything you need to make things easier, to make things more easily understood for you, I want to do it. That's literally why I'm here. So just let me know what that will be, and I will be happy to do it. So today, last week, we talked about Jesus' life and teachings. We talked about the kingdom of God a lot. We're talking about now his death and resurrection. And the reading was there were a couple of Bible passages. I asked you to read the Passion narrative from Luke. Also asked you to read 1 Corinthians 15. But most of your reading was coming from Borg and Wright. And I hope you're liking that. I told you before, I love this book. Because Borg and Wright are coming from two very different places. But they're disagreeing well. They're disagreeing with charity, with friendship. And I just love it. But death and resurrection is what we're talking about this week. And if I could sum up Borg and Wright's positions when it comes to this issue, I'll say it this way. Wright argues that the empty tomb, Jesus' empty tomb, generates the claims that Jesus is alive and Jesus is Lord. Borg, on the other hand, argues that the claims that Jesus is alive and Jesus is Lord generates the idea of the empty tomb. So Wright is much more of a traditional position. He says the empty tomb, the early church responds to that and says, yes, Jesus really was who he claimed to be. Whereas Borg says these claims that Jesus was alive, resurrected, and Jesus was Lord, the early church had to go back and fill in the gaps to make the story align with what they already believed about Jesus. So it's very different ways of looking at the Messiah, what his purpose was, and what the death and resurrection was all about. And that's the primary subject of our time together today. So Borg is your first chapter in the reading, and Borg starts off by talking about the traditional understanding of Jesus' death, which was salvific, which is a fancy word, but basically what the word means is that the primary purpose of Jesus' life was to die. This is a very popular understanding in Christian thought over the years. There's a hymn from Michael W. Smith, who's a famous Christian singer. The hymn is called Above All, and consider these lyrics. He says, crucified, laid behind the stone, you lived to die, rejected and alone, like a rose trampled on the ground, you took the fall and thought of me above all. Some of you in evangelical church backgrounds, you've probably heard this song. But that line, you lived to die, reflects a traditional understanding of Jesus' life. Why did Jesus come? What did he come to do? And the traditional answer was he came to he basically came to offer himself. He came to die. He came to be resurrected. And his death and resurrection is the most significant thing about him. All the other stuff is nice. It makes for good storytelling. But what fundamentally is the crux of what he's doing is this death and resurrection narrative. And you also see this reflected in the Gospels themselves. And the Gospel of Mark is the most famous example. Martin Kahler was a German theologian. He called the Gospel of Mark a passion narrative with an extended introduction. And the reason he did that, Mark is 15, 16 chapters. About the first half of the book is Jesus' life and ministry. The entire second half of the book is devoted to the last week of his life, including his death and resurrection. So just when it comes to perspective, when it comes to the amount of time spent on particular aspects of Jesus' life, the Gospels spend a lot more time on the last week of his life, on his death, on his resurrection, than they do in his life and ministry. It just really is fundamentally, it's just significantly more time spent on this last event, this culminating event of Jesus' life. So the traditional understanding of Jesus' life was that, he came to die and to be resurrected. That was the fundamental purpose. All this other stuff was great, but it's kind of side material. The fundamental purpose was he is going to be, Isaiah 53, he's going to be someone who by his stripes we are healed. That's the traditional understanding, and that's the understanding, quite frankly, that Borg has an issue with. Because Borg says, did Jesus himself see his mission in this way? Did Jesus himself believe that he had come to die? And according to Borg, the answer to that question is no. This is something that stems from the earliest Christian communities and their interpretation of Jesus' life. But when it comes to Jesus' own sense of his own calling, his own destiny, Borg says this is not what he had in mind. And the way that he defends this in a number of different ways, and especially if you grew up, because there's a lot of people in this class that grew up in Christian backgrounds, and you're still Christian and you go to church, and that's great. Welcome. But I really hope that Borg is ringing your bell a little bit, because Borg is coming from a different place, and he's saying, you know what? I'm going to respect Jesus' calling. I'm going to respect his position as Messiah, but at the same time, I'm not willing to argue that he saw his mission as I'm coming to die and be resurrected to forgive the sins of everyone, of the population. That's not what Borg's about. That's not what he wants to do. So he says, this is different. This is not how Jesus saw himself. And as evidence, he points to the areas in the Gospels that quite plainly indicate that the disciples were unprepared for the idea of Jesus' dying. They didn't know how to they went back to fishing. They were fishermen, and then Jesus comes and says, "Follow me, and I will make you fishers of men." They become disciples. When Jesus died, the Gospels record that they went back to fishing. They didn't know what else to do. I guess we'll go back to our old life. So this is Borg is taking this point and he's saying, look at. If the disciples were unprepared for the idea of Jesus' dying and their hopes were shattered by his death, then maybe one way for them to find hope in the despair is to build this narrative up of this is what Jesus expected, this is what Jesus' life was about, was to come and to die and to be resurrected. So Borg has an interesting take, but the way that he proceeds, the way that he argues, we talked about this before, but he wants to talk about the Jesus of history versus the Christ of faith. And he wants to talk about the sharp division between those two individuals, if you will. He's saying that the early church they're not just doing straight history. They are doing what he calls prophecy historicized. And what does that mean? That means that the New Testament writers tailor their story to match Hebrew. They're building their narratives about Jesus' life and what he came to do and his death and resurrection. And they're building their story around the Hebrew prophecies that they have in front of them. Whereas the traditional story is to say, hey, look, Jesus came and he fulfilled all these Old Testament prophecies. Borg's position is to say that the New Testament writers used the Old Testament prophecies in such a way as to build the story of Jesus' life. Do you see the difference there? The traditional position says, look at Jesus fulfilled all these Old Testament prophecies. Isn't that interesting? Borg's position is to say that the life that Jesus lived, that the early church, in their desire to build the Christ of faith as opposed to the Jesus of history, were telling the story of his life and incorporating these Old Testament prophecies to build up the story that they were making, that they were creating in and of themselves. So it's a very different way. It's a more cynical perspective for sure, but it's a different way to look at it. So he says, you know what? A lot of the stuff that we find is prophecy historic. It's not predictions fulfilled. It's not like, Micah says this and then Jesus' life does this. It's prophecy historicized. It's the gospel writers saying, we need Jesus's narrative to have this in it. Let's pull this verse in from Micah in order to make that happen. And part of that, and part of the reasoning for that, which I really thought was fascinating, your discussion question is based on it. I want to read this quote because I think it's really striking. It's on page 82 of The Meaning of Jesus, where Borg says this. He says, "Honesty compels candor. I find this, and this being the traditional narrative, not only a strange notion, but an unattractive notion to attribute to Jesus. I don't want Jesus to have seen his own death as having the significance Tom gives to it. As a Christian, I want Jesus to be an attractive figure. Obviously, wanting Jesus to be attractive cannot be a criterion for making historical judgments, and I must factor this desire into my historical judgment not only about this matter, but about every other historical decision I make about Jesus." But basically what he's saying there, what Borg is saying, is that the idea that Jesus knew that he had to die in order to fulfill his mission is unattractive. Aesthetically, it's not pleasing. It's unattractive. It's not the Savior. It's not the Jesus that Borg wants. And it's a striking, I can't believe he's making this admission. Because what he's saying not so much is I'm going to trust the history, I'm going to trust the scholarship, but basically what he's saying is I don't want my Jesus to have this understanding that, look, this is what I've come to do. I've come to die and be resurrected. That's not the Jesus that I want to worship. And it is just striking that Borg would come to this place. And Wright's going to, we'll see, Wright's going to call him on it, as we'll see. But it's an amazing quote. It's basically, it's Borg saying, I don't like the idea of a Messiah who comes understanding that dying in a really painful, humiliating way is part of the job description. I want my Jesus to be more attractive. I want my Jesus to be more, more in line with what I think the Messiah would do. It's really it's amazing. But yeah, Borg sees the traditional understanding of Jesus as someone whose death is a fundamental part of his mission as aesthetically unattractive, as something that he cannot get behind, and it's really amazing. But that's part of his reasoning. So Borg, the reason Borg thinks what he does, the nature of prophecy, he believes that the Old Testament church is creating a lot of these narratives and pulling in Old Testament prophecies to support these narratives. He has the aesthetic reasons, which we already talked about, his personal stuff, where it's like, I don't want a Jesus who believed that he was here to die. Also, maybe more compelling, he says, you know what, if Jesus' fundamental purpose was to come and die, then what does that do for the first 32 years and 51 weeks of his life? I mean, if the last week of his life gets all the attention, what does that make for the rest of it? What does that make for his life and his accomplishments and his healings and his exorcisms and all the stuff we talked about last week? His preaching the kingdom of God. Does all of that take a secondary role if his primary purpose was to die and be resurrected? And this is not just Borg that's talking about this. This is a very common question. And the way that I've seen it framed, there's a tension between the cross and the crown. And the cross is this traditional position of he had to die and be resurrected. But the crown is a sense of he came to inaugurate the kingdom of God, to start the process, and ultimately to wear the crown of that process. And there's always been tension. More liberal, progressive Christians have always tended to look at Jesus and say, look, he fed the poor, and he healed the sick, and he hung out with the undesirable, and this is what we're supposed to do as a result. Whereas more evangelical, more fundamentalist Christians have said, no, he came to die and be resurrected and to offer forgiveness for our sins as a sin offering. And there's always been that division. Very rarely have you seen it where Christian expressions have been able to reconcile both parts, where it's like, yes, he came to be a physical, he came to do this. He came to feed the poor and heal the sick and be this physical manifestation of the kingdom of God on the one hand, but he also came for the spiritual representation of dying and being rose again in order to have a spiritual victory and to forgive sins, which is a very spiritual idea. And it's hard to manage and to integrate both of those ideas. And we're seeing that in Borg and Wright's perspective on the matter. So he says, the idea that Jesus came to die and be resurrected downgrades Jesus' life and accomplishments. He also has a lot of textual questions, and I won't work through all of them because it would take too much time. But he has textual questions. For example, the sections of the gospel that show Jesus clearly by himself. How do the gospel writers know how those situations went? So when Jesus sweats blood in the Garden of Gethsemane, for example, how do they know that? Who told them? Or the parts that they weren't invited to, the trials before Caiaphas and Pilate. How did they find out about these things? It's funny, Wright says, that's silly, word would have spread. These were really big, important, influential events, and the gossip would have flown as soon as these ideas happened. But Borg says, how did these gospel writers know about this? I think it was a fabrication. I think it was a historical imagining of how they believed these situations would have gone. So again, you have really, and one of the reasons, I keep talking about how much I love this book, and I do love this book, but Borg and Wright are coming from two very different perspectives, where Wright is kind of the traditionalist saying, yes, it basically happened like the gospel said that it did, where Borg is saying, no, it's a lot of history, it's a lot of historical imagining what they think might have happened, building narratives, incorporating Old Testament prophecies into those narratives, not really, historically, forensically true. So he's got textual questions. He wants to know how the gospel writers knew what they knew. And basically, on page 84, you can see that Borg wants to say that there are 4 elements included in the gospel narratives. There's history remembered, the stuff that actually happened. There's prophecy historicized, the Old Testament bits that were drawn in to strengthen the story. Imaginative elaborations, like Jesus before Pilate or Jesus before Caiaphas, the stuff that the disciples didn't have access to. And then there's purposive interpretation, where it's like, all right, we have a larger narrative, a larger story that we're telling, and we're going to make the events of Jesus' life fit into that larger narrative. So Borg is very skeptical, overall, he's very skeptical that the Gospels are really reporting history as it happened. So what does he accept? He accepts the fact that Jesus' last week had a lot of controversy, that he had a lot of run-ins with Pharisees and temple officials, and there was a lot of that. He accepts some sort of Last Supper, some sort of meal, maybe not quite as ritualized, but he accepts the fact that he called his disciples to have a last meal with him. Borg accepts Jesus' betrayal and arrest. And he also accepts the crucifixion, because Roman execution for criminals and revolutionaries was not an uncommon phenomenon in the ancient world. They killed these people in the most public, humiliating, painful way possible as a way to tell the rest of the population, if you step out of line, this is going to happen to you too. So, Rome was famous for that, where it's like, we're going to make an example out of these people. And he has no problem thinking of Jesus as someone that the Roman Empire would want to make an example out of. In his words, Jesus was crucified as a political threat to Roman order. So you have someone who might be an instigator, might be a revolutionary, right? Might be an undesirable. And the Roman Empire says, our evidence might be a little fuzzy, but we need to make an example of this cat to make sure that others might not want to follow in his footsteps. So we're going to kill him in the most painful, humiliating way possible to scare off the rest of the population and go, you know what? If we want to try to make these types of claims that Jesus is making, we might want to think twice about that. So that's Borg's take. And Borg says, here's what the gospel writers did. They shifted blame to the Jews in order to provide political cover. Because there are some really inflammatory passages in Matthew and John in particular, where they look at the Jews as the primary instigators of Jesus' death. And according to Borg, he's saying, that the church wasn't stupid. The church shifted the blame to the Jews in order to provide political cover so that they could go to the Roman authorities and say, we follow a teacher who the Romans killed, but that's not because the Romans were led astray as much as it was they were placating the Jews. They killed our teacher or leader only at the insistence of the Jews. Because remember, Christianity has to make it as a religion in a Roman world. So when you say, who do we follow? We follow Jesus. Who's that guy? Oh, that's the one the Romans killed. that could be uncomfortable. So what Borg is saying is that the church said, yes, the Romans killed them, but only at the behest of the Jewish population. We got no beef with Rome. The problem was that the Jewish authorities wanted this man dead, and they convinced the Roman authorities to go ahead and make that happen. So in so doing, it's political cover. It's the Christians going, we're going to make our position safer under the Roman authorities by saying, you know what, the Roman authorities did kill Jesus, but it wasn't their fault. It was something that the Jewish population, the Jewish rulers compelled them to do. And as Borg points out, the fact that these Gospels do point at the Jews as the instigators for Jesus' death, no matter where your position on the spectrum is, I think you have to admit that it led to a lot of really awful consequences. There's a long history of Christians persecuting Jews in the name of you are Christ killers. Your people killed Jesus, killed the Christ, so we're free to mistreat you in a million different ways. There's a long history of that, where Christians are acting badly towards Jews in the name of, you were Christ killers, so you deserve this punishment. And Borg mentions it, and rightly, I think, mentions it as a dark spot on the Christian record. But part of that, in Borg's mind, part of that is, the story is fabricated. The story is, the Christian gospel writers tell the story as a way to provide cover for themselves and their religious movement to say, we got no beef with the Romans, it's the Jews that caused all this mess. And the result was a long history of Christians persecuting Jews, which is a sad one. But anyway, the big question for Borg was Jesus killed for a political reason or for a theological one? And ultimately for Borg, he says Jesus was killed for a political reason because he was a threat to the order of the Roman government. It's not so much because he was Messiah or any type of theological reasoning. The reason he was killed was primarily because he was a threat to the Roman order. So then you get into Wright, and Wright responds. And how does Wright respond? Well, first of all, he says Jesus knew what was going on. We talked last week about how Jesus was in Wright's perspective, Jesus recreates Israel's story. He gets baptized and he comes up out of the waters, which is a Red Sea narrative. He goes to the desert for 40 days, which is an allusion to Israel's time for 40 years in the desert. He picks 12 disciples, which is an allusion to the 12 tribes. All of these things are living, kind of restating the story of Israel in and of himself. And in Wright's take, he's still doing it. And he says Jesus knew that a catalytic event was needed, that it was up to him to fight the true battle, that he is going to be... Israel's whole story is that Israel is called to be a blessing to the world. This is Abraham in Genesis 12. Israel is called to bless the world with their presence and with their role as God's chosen. Jesus, according to Wright, Jesus picks up that narrative and says, I will take it unto myself to be that way. I will be that person. I will be that individual. And he does it. And and this is according to Wright, this is in keeping with first century Jewish thought. If you talk about the servant songs in Isaiah and this idea of redemptive suffering, that Israel, the true Israel, would serve the world not through might or military conquest, but through redemptive suffering. They're pouring themselves out for the world. And according to Wright, Jesus is fulfilling that role in the work that he does in his salvific mission. This is what Jesus is feeling called to do, and this is what he does. Now, Wright feels the need to answer some objections. He says, wait, is this, in Wright's terms, is this a complicated form of suicide? And according to Wright, no, this is accepting the logical outworking of your actions. And he mentions Socrates as someone who knows that what he's doing might get him killed, but his calling, he has a larger calling and a higher purpose, and he's willing to accept the consequences of his actions. He's not willingly killing himself as much as he's saying, I'm going to follow my principles, I'm going to follow my values, and if that leads to me being killed, then I'm willing to, no pun intended, I'm willing to live with that. Then he goes on to answer Borg, where Borg says the idea of a Christ who is come to die and be resurrected is not an attractive figure. Wright says, if we throw out the things that we find distasteful, we construct Jesus in our own image. He's accusing, I mean, in a nice way, but he's accusing Wright of saying you are crafting a Jesus that is basically a Jesus that you like. And it's unrelated to a Jesus that is actually real or historical. There's a famous saying, a turn of phrase, where it says, God created humans in his image and humans return the favor. And this is what Wright says that Borg is essentially doing. Borg is a theologian. He is a kind of an upper crust individual. Wright basically says, Borg, you are crafting a Jesus that is in line with what you like and who you are and what your aesthetic sensibilities are. This is who you are. Albert Schweitzer most famously was critiquing liberal theologians at the turn of the 20th century, and he said, you know what, these people in their search for the historical Jesus are like people who look down into the bottom of the well and see their own image and say, that's what he looks like. So Jesus becomes whoever I want him to become. If I'm a liberal theologian, that's who Jesus must be as well, because I'm seeing my own reflection. And Wright says this is exactly what Borg is doing. So Wright spends more time on the theology. If Jesus is the Messiah, it's a clear and present danger to the Jewish authorities, for they haven't accepted him as Messiah. So Borg wants to talk about political reasons for Jesus' death. Wright wants to talk about theological reasons. He's not willing to accept the claim that theology of the situation is just later Christians adding it back in. Wright says this is how Jesus understood it in his own mind, and this was the theological situation that Jesus lived out in his life. Where Borg wants to say this is stuff that kind of organically developed in the church many years after Jesus had already died. Wright says, no, this was part of his understanding and part of the fundamental understanding of the Messiah, what Jesus was supposed to do. The theology of the situation, argues Wright, threatened the Jewish leaders' well-being and also Pilate's well-being, and therefore Jesus had to die. So, Borg almost paints Jesus' death as accidental, something that just kind of happened, and the church had to adapt and adjust, and they came up with these narratives in order to do so. Wright says these are much more fundamental to the story, to the original story of who Jesus is and what he came to do. This is who he is. So again, this is much more in line with the traditional position. So what is Wright ultimately arguing about Jesus' death and resurrection? He's basically, in not so many words, this is the hinge point of history, where Jesus is being the true Israel, being who Israel was originally called to be. Who was Israel originally called to be? The vessel by which God would exercise his dominion over the whole world and would basically save the whole world. And this is what Wright is arguing that Jesus is doing. Jesus' death represents year one of the new era, where if the old era was marked by sin and violence and hatred, then this new era is marked by Jesus' death and resurrection. This is the entryway for our new kingdom, for a new way of being, in which peace would rule. This is the entryway towards Isaiah 11, where it says the lion lays down with the lamb, and so on and so forth. This is the hinge point of history, where the world is no longer ruled by violence and hatred, but there's a new kingdom which has been given birth to, and it's going to uproot the old kingdom, and it's nothing less than a victory over evil. So this is a huge cosmic event, according to Wright. Now, Wright says, be that as it may, the fair follow-up question is, okay, if this is what Jesus' death and resurrection did, then why does evil still hang around? Why does this happen? And the way that Wright answers this question is basically the already but not yet. Jesus has instigated the new era of history. He has inaugurated the new era of history, but it hasn't been consummated yet. It hasn't been fully fulfilled yet. That will happen when Jesus comes again, and we'll talk about second coming next week. But Wright says that Jesus starts the new era of God's rule over earth and inaugurates something that will be fully fulfilled at the end of history, when all the wrongs will be made right, and there will be no more violence, no more hatred, and no more tears, and victory will be won over all of that. So this is what Jesus' death to Wright represents. So we start talking about resurrection and what that means. Wright points out that there were a wide range of opinions in the first century Jewish world, but literal physical resurrection was not an uncommon belief during this time, that there were a lot of people, including the Pharisees, by the way, who were expecting a literal physical resurrection. They were expecting that God's chosen people, the true nation of Israel, the ones who had not bent the knee to Baal, the ones who had not fallen away, would all be resurrected together. And they would be brought together physically, bodily, as God's people in God's new promised land. This is something that they believed would happen. So the Christian narrative, it wasn't far off from that, just to see Jesus as the first fruits, as the first representative of something that would later be something that would happen on a communal scale. So Jesus is resurrected. In the traditionalist understanding, Jesus is resurrected first, kind of prefiguring the mass collective resurrection of his people that would happen at the end of history. So this is Wright's perspective, and again, it's a very traditional perspective. And this is where I asked you to read 1 Corinthians 15, because 1 Corinthians 15 is interesting because it sheds light on this. Because it says resurrection is a historical event. It's the beginning of the end, but at the same time, it's also a new period of history. And St. Paul, in writing this material, says, look at your body will be resurrected. There will be continuity. It'll be the same body, but at the same time, there's discontinuity in the sense that there will be transformation. There will be a spiritual body that arises, a fully ensouled body. So there will be this sense of change, but at the same time remaining the same. And 1 Corinthians 15 is a fascinating take because this is Paul basically talking about resurrection, the implications of resurrection. And according to the text, St. Paul says, if Jesus did not physically raise, then Christians above all people are most to be pitied. Because what on earth are Christians putting their hope in, if not this physical resurrection? Borg's going to have something to say about this, but this, again, this is a traditional position. And it's interesting, worth noting the city of Corinth, its context, where Greek dualism was ruling, this kind of sense of, bodily stuff is generally bad and spiritual stuff is generally good. Paul says the bodily resurrection has to happen in order for the spiritual resurrection to make any sense, in order for it to be real and to be worth anything. So it's kind of a counter to that. So Wright's conclusion, he says, you know what, Wright is forthright. Wright is forthright. He says, I believe in the resurrection, and I believe that those people who want to kind of shoehorn Christianity, in his phrase, into an apartment in the Enlightenment's housing scheme are taking something fundamentally away from the faith in the process. And he says, I'm not willing to do that. I'm willing to accept the fact that Jesus might co-opt physical laws and physical rules in order for this resurrection to happen. Again, it's a very traditional understanding. The way Borg answers, Borg answers by posing his own question. He says, could the resurrection be videotaped? Is this a historical event that could have been caught on camera if such a technology existed at the time? His answer is no. According to Borg, the resurrection narratives are a product of a developing tradition and as powerfully true metaphorical narratives. What does that mean? He says, basically, it's not a sense of whether Jesus was risen historically or not. It's just the idea of resurrection and spiritual renewal is what carries the power. So for Borg, quoting him here, the truth of Easter is not at stake in this issue. He's arguing for a spiritual resurrection, not a physical resuscitation, in his words. He argues that Easter is a spiritual reality. Jesus is alive in how his followers experience him. So again, it's not dependent on whether Jesus was bodily raised or not. It's more of a sense of his followers experienced him as that, and the experience of Jesus is omnipresent. It can be experienced anywhere and at any time. And for that reason, that's why we call Jesus Lord, because that experience can be experienced anywhere and at any time. And that's where the suggestion comes that Jesus is omnipotent, omnicompetent, omniscient, in the sense that he can be experienced by his followers in that way. Whereas Wright would argue that no, he really is these things. Borg says no, he's these things in the sense that this is how his followers can experience him as such. So again, it's two very different ways of looking at these events. Wright is much more traditional in his understanding that yes, these things actually physically occurred. Wright says no, I'm not willing to grant these things legitimacy in how they physically occurred. I am willing to grant them legitimacy in their spiritual power. So the question becomes then, can you can these things carry power if they don't happen physically? Or another way to put that, is Easter meaningful for Borg? He argues that it is. He says, look, it's vindication of Jesus. It's defeat of the powers. It's Jesus as the way, showing God's love. But he's not one to argue for the physical death and resurrection, whereas Wright is. So the fundamental difference, Wright's insistence that the physical and the spiritual are combined, while Borg leans on a more spiritual understanding of the death and resurrection. And the question becomes, do we need a physical resurrection in order for Jesus' death to have spiritual power? Borg says no. Borg says if it happened or not, the resurrection, the church experienced it as having happened. And there was power in that. And they were strengthened by that. So even if you could capture Jesus' resurrection on a videotape or not, it had power in the sense that it was spiritually meaningful. And Borg basically says that's not, and Wright, basically says that's nonsense. That if it didn't happen physically, it carries no spiritual power. So there are two very different ways, two very fundamentally different ways of looking at Jesus' resurrection. The traditional perspective says he had to physically die and be resurrected in order for this to make any sense. And this is St. Paul's perspective, this is the Gospel's perspective. But Borg says, and Borg is, again, skeptical of the miraculous in the Gospel accounts. He says, look at whether Jesus clearly was crucified, but whether he's resurrected doesn't matter because the early church experienced him as such in the way that they constructed these narratives. So this is the difference between a traditionalist understanding of Christianity and a more mainline, progressive, liberal understanding. Borg represents that position where it says, it was spiritually meaningful, therefore it was meaningful. Whereas Wright says it has to be spiritual, it has to be physically meaningful in order to be spiritually meaningful. Now, in terms of where you fall on that, again, there's going to be differences of opinion. One question I do have for someone who follows Borg's position, if it's only spiritual, then does the physical body matter? Wright is insistent that the physical body matters, that Jesus' resurrection validates the care and the worth of the physical body, whereas a more spiritual understanding of the death and resurrection says, if the spirit's all that matters, that's basically Gnosticism, and the body doesn't really matter that much. I'm not going to go into my own take on that position, only to say that these are the types of questions that come from these different perspectives on the death and resurrection. So that was kind of a whirlwind tour. If you have any questions, let me know. Next week, the name of the lecture next week is Who is this guy? And we examine the divinity claims of Jesus Christ. Is he the second person of the Trinity? Is he God? What does that mean? But in the meantime, again, if you have any questions, let me know. This is a really fast lecture, but it's a really fascinating idea, this whole section of what, did Jesus really die? Borg and Wright both go, yeah. Was he resurrected? Wright says, yes, he was physically resurrected. Borg says, no, I don't think he was. And how does that affect their understanding of Jesus' mission as Messiah, what that means, and what that means for Christianity and the church going forward? So next week, the divinity claims, and we go forward. If you have any questions, let me know. Otherwise, have a lovely Labor Day weekend. I will talk to you next week. Bye-bye.